What if Christopher Nolan directed a Godzilla movie? After my last video on how Godzilla Minus One can be seen as a sequel to Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer, some of you commented on how it would be pretty incredible to see Christopher Nolan actually make a Godzilla film. I completely agree. Nolan is one of my all-time favorite filmmakers, and seeing his take on a Godzilla story would be phenomenal. But would a Christopher Nolan Godzilla movie be essentially Godzilla Minus One? How might it be similar? How might it be different? Based on Nolan's body of work, we can look at the core themes and philosophical ideas that he consistently comes back to in his movies, and we can imagine what a Christopher Nolan Godzilla movie might be like. First, let's talk about the setting. Whether it's Dunkirk, Oppenheimer, or even the vastly underrated 2006 The Prestige, which was set in the 1890s, Nolan has demonstrated that he can do wonders with films set in past historical contexts, even if the entirety of the story he's telling isn't focused on portraying all historical events. I mentioned this in my first video on Godzilla Minus One, but Godzilla Minus One already has very strong elements of Dunkirk, especially in the third act. So I think setting a Christopher Nolan Godzilla film in an immediate post-war Japan still works, even if Godzilla Minus One did it so well. There's still plenty in Nolan's common repertoire of themes and philosophical provocations to make something uniquely different from Godzilla Minus One, or even the original Gojira film from 1954. So let's go ahead and set Nolan's Godzilla movie in post-war Japan. But what should be its central theme? If we look at the long list of Christopher Nolan films, there's one core thematic tension running throughout most of Nolan's movies. And that is the tension between the nihilistic despair of our secular age and the existentialist hope of creating meaning in an absurd world. All of Nolan's films exist within the bounds of philosophical materialism, or what some might call physicalism. You'll notice that there is no magic or supernatural events in Nolan's movies. It all plays within the bounds of what a Neil deGrasse Tyson or Richard Dawkins might believe about reality. It's explainable by science. Fully grounded Batman movies with no superpowered villains, sci-fi movies with none of the Star Wars fantasy elements. Now, sometimes Nolan pushes his audience to what philosopher Charles Taylor called being haunted by the transcendent, whether that's with the illusions of the magicians in The Prestige or in Cooper's quest for meaning as he hunts the ghost of his daughter's room in Interstellar. But in the end, despite the longings for something more being present in Nolan's films, there are no spirits, deities, or some truly transcendent higher power beyond the bounds of our scientific worldview. Now, what Nolan brilliantly understands about this is that this closed material universe, brought about by cosmic statistical accident and governed not by mind or God, but by chaotic chance and randomness, this inevitably leads one to the conclusion that there is no higher purpose or meaning in life to be discovered. So what are we to do with an absurd world that has no objective purpose? No single character embodies this sense of nihilistic despair better than Nolan's take on the Joker in The Dark Knight. And Joker's opening line in The Dark Knight gives us every reason to believe that Nolan has grappled with the philosophical foundations of these questions, found in the likes of philosophers such as Friedrich Nietzsche. In fact, it's no accident that Joker paraphrases Nietzsche in his opening line, which reveals himself as the Joker.
I believe whatever doesn't kill you simply makes you stranger.
Nolan is constantly grasping for meaning in a world that appears meaningless, and his heroes almost always function as existentialist heroes who choose to make meaning in their meaningless worlds. Whether it's Batman in an absurd Gotham or Cooper in Interstellar believing that the love he feels towards his children isn't merely the result of evolutionary, advantageous, but ultimately mindless programming, Nolan's protagonists are often choosing meaning up against worlds that might convince lesser men that they are meaningless. Nolan's take on Godzilla could be a symbolic representation of a random, chaotic universe with a monster who, unlike the legendary Godzilla movies, isn't driven by evolutionary instinct to be the alpha monster. But instead, Nolan's Godzilla could be much more akin to the Leviathan like Godzilla of Godzilla Minus One, who appears to have no clear motivation for wreaking havoc upon the citizens of Japan. A monster who destroys without any coherent motivation is far more terrifying. Nolan could find ways of having the characters in the story search for a pattern of behavior to Godzilla, but frustratingly find no real cause or pattern to the monster's rampage. They could feel the weight of despair and the accompanying feeling of powerlessness. But like the heroes of Godzilla Minus One, Nolan's protagonists must rebel against the consensus of despair and the apathy that accompanies the sense that their world is destined for annihilation. Another common theme across Nolan films that'd be interesting to incorporate into a Godzilla movie could be the way that Nolan plays with perceptions of reality and subjectivity, like what you see in Memento and Inception. I think it'd be fascinating to have scenarios where initial reports of Godzilla's attacks happen on more remote islands or smaller Japanese cities where perhaps the only survivor is a child or an elderly person. And this maybe less than trustworthy eyewitness says that a monster did this and no one believes them. Instead, they believe maybe that this is an American attack or some other foreign invader. Perhaps there's even flashbacks from the survivors' points of view in which you can hear Godzilla's roar, but you only get to see the devastation of the town as if it's being firebombed or hit with another atomic bomb. You as the audience would be left wondering throughout the movie whether or not this Godzilla story is a historical reality or a symbolic manifestation of PTSD. I think that would be really fascinating. I think if you went this route, you'd have to almost do the Alfred Hitchcock kind of move, where you don't really show what everyone is afraid of on the screen until maybe like the third act of the film. I think that could be really interesting. I also think that there's ways that Nolan could establish a sense of grounded historical reality in a way that might make it hard for the audience to even believe that a giant monster like Godzilla could exist. Perhaps you could even get like competing factions of characters who are arguing for and against these monster stories as maybe being a form of foreign propaganda. I could see Nolan incorporating different responses to the nihilistic despair among these factions happening in almost like a Kierkegaardian approach. Søren Kierkegaard was a 19th century Danish philosopher who proposed a theory of life's stages or spheres of existence. He outlined 3 primary stages through which an individual might pass on a journey of authenticity, of self-discovery, of meaning. The first stage is the aesthetic stage. This is the initial phase of personal development characterized by the pursuit of pleasure, aesthetic experiences, and the enjoyment of life's immediate pleasures. Individuals in this stage are often driven by their senses and emotions, and they seek a variety of distracting experiences, things that would distract them from despair, distract them from the commitment and responsibility that comes with leading what Kierkegaard called an authentic life. And this stage is marked by a lack of deep meaning or purpose, as the individual is primarily focused on superficial experiences that keep them away from the absurdity of life and keep them away from that sense of despair. And so I think it'd be really interesting to see a group of characters in a Nolan Godzilla movie responding to the stories of Godzilla with this typical aesthetic stage response. And then maybe you have another set of characters that are, maybe they moved from that aesthetic stage to Kierkegaard's ethical stage. In Kierkegaard's ethical stage, individuals move beyond the immediate pleasures and trying to distract themselves, and they start to focus on ethical principles and a sense of responsibility. This is a stage of personal growth, moral development, where people become more concerned with the societal norms, the moral duties of their community, and the pursuit of the good. They begin to make commitments in their personal relationships or career or their extended community, and these commitments give them a sense of purpose and direction. The ethical stage is characterized by a recognition of and an adherence to the society's rules and moral standards. Nolan could have characters who, still maybe uncertain of Godzilla reports, they see the devastation of these supposed Godzilla attacks. They don't know what it is. Maybe they're not ready to come face to face all the way with this despair, but they begin to take steps towards recognizing their moral duty to care for survivors or prepare for future attacks, whatever the attacks may be. It'd be interesting to have these two groups in tension and then to bring in, this third group of characters, the final stage for Kierkegaard, which he called the religious stage. And it's in that stage, this final stage, which is the most profound stage of Kierkegaard's existentialist philosophy. This stage transcends the aesthetic and ethical stages, and it focuses on the individual's personal relationship with the divine, with the good, with the absolute. And this stage is marked by the famous Kierkegaardian leap of faith, where the individual comes face to face with despair. They come face to face with the absurdity of the world. And instead of running away from it or merely seeking to live just purely a moral life to kind of get along with the rules, they come face to face with despair and they choose meaning. They take a leap of faith into meaning where it may be uncertain that there's any real meaning in life, a truth that goes beyond merely a rational understanding of the world or the ethical norms of society. It would involve a commitment to trusting the transcendent God, where one finds true meaning and purpose. The religious stage is characterized by a sense of individuality and personal responsibility before God, leading to a life of genuine self-fulfillment and spiritual understanding. And I recognize this kind of move for Nolan would be outside of his previous storytelling ventures, but that's what I think would be so interesting. And maybe that was similar to what he had Cooper doing in Interstellar, trying to find some transcendent anchor point in love beyond himself. I think it'd be fascinating to see all these kinds of characters dealing with the absurdity of Godzilla, the nihilistic despair of Godzilla. Now, connected to Nolan's sense of playing with perceptions of reality is the way he tends to also play with the audience's sense of time and even incorporate non-linear storytelling. The most obvious example of this, right, is his film Tenet. But he also does this in Inception with Dreamtime, Interstellar with General Relativity, and he even does it in Dunkirk and Oppenheimer. And one of the ways he does that is in the way he collaborates with his score and soundtrack composers. The score will contain changing meter or beats per minute are changing that continually escalate towards a crescendo. Or maybe sometimes you can catch this, with Hans Zimmer, for example. He often partners with Hans Zimmer in his scores and soundtracks. This string section might slowly build tension, tension, tension until finally reaching a climactic moment. That's one of the ways that Nolan seems to play with our sense of time. He does this obviously with the non-linear storytelling, things like Dreamtime, but he also can do this through the medium of sound production and the story that accompanies a beautiful piece of music that's written with intentionality steering the audience's emotions in a particular way. And I think he does that a lot in Dunkirk too. That's a great example of just where the soundtrack seems to be escalating our perception of time. I could see Nolan doing this with a final Godzilla reveal, right? A soundtrack, and he does this sometimes with his composers where it's almost like there's a ticking noise or a drum beat that is speeding up in meter and time. I could see him doing this with a final act, a third act reveal of Godzilla, where maybe Godzilla's approach from the sea gradually crescendos into this tidal wave and a climactic reveal of the giant beast. He could also do something like he did in Interstellar with aged survivors. Maybe they're living in the 1980s or 1990s and they're retelling their Godzilla horror stories through flashbacks. I don't know, that might be cool too. Now, you don't have a Christopher Nolan movie if you don't have characters wrestling with moral ambiguity and being put in ethical dilemmas. And if this movie is set in immediate post war Japan or with survivors retelling their memories of post war Japan, then you already have a built in historical context filled with plenty of moral dilemmas to choose from. You could have characters from Japan and the US grappling with the ethical dilemmas of their behavior in the war, similar to the protagonist in Godzilla Minus One. You can have characters processing the fallout and geopolitical after effects of Oppenheimer's bomb. You can have the audience feel the tension of a demilitarized Japan attempting to defend themselves from the monster. And that kind of happened in Godzilla Minus One too. And whether or not Americans have any moral responsibility to help them, I think that would be an interesting side that they could have played on more. I know this was a Japanese film, so maybe they didn't expect it to have such wild success here in America, but I think that would be an interesting side to explore. Would America have any moral responsibility to help the Japanese people if there really was a Godzilla attacking Japan? I mean, especially considering that our bomb made the monster, right? So would we have some sort of moral obligation to help? I think there's a lot that could be done there in a Christopher Nolan Godzilla movie. And finally, there's one pressing question about how Nolan would pull this off. Given how much Nolan seems to detest CGI and how he prefers to use practical effects whenever he can, how would he pull off the physical appearance of Godzilla and any of the devastation the colossal beast would inflict upon his environment? How would he do that? Now, someone mentioned this in the comments on a previous video, and I think I agree with them. If anyone could somehow pull off a man in convincing Godzilla suit destroys miniature models of cities and landscapes and have it look legit, I think it could be Christopher Nolan. I don't think it has to look like Showa-era Godzilla movies. If you look at the more relatively recent, like Godzilla versus Space Godzilla and Godzilla versus Destroya suits, you could imagine those suits don't look terrible. You could imagine how Christopher Nolan could improve upon that and make something pretty convincing. And man, would I love to see how Nolan would attempt to pull off Godzilla's atomic breath without CGI, especially if the movie was paced like Oppenheimer, where it's not happening like every 5 scenes, right? And then it just kind of becomes like, a stronger punch or kick move. Like if it actually had some gravitas to it, you could treat the pacing of this like Oppenheimer, where you get like one atomic blast from Godzilla as the climactic moment in the final act of the film. I think that would be pretty incredible. Now, I think Godzilla Minus One did a great job with its CGI, especially considering its minuscule budget. But I still find that more times than not, the uncanny valley is still big enough to take me out of a moment when I see a CGI character or a monster surrounded by flesh and blood actors and practical sets. It's one thing if we're going to go like Star Wars prequels on it and just green screen everything. That makes sense. The environments, the characters, they kind of all come together in a cohesive way. But it's another thing if you're like an Indiana Jones movie with practical sets set in a historical context, and then you fill it with a bunch of CGI effects. Yeah, I'm not a fan of what they did with the last Indiana Jones movie. But again, I think Nolan could pull off an almost like 100%, maybe 90% CGI-free Godzilla film that I think would be pretty incredible. Would I love to see that kind of movie? Would I love to see Nolan do Godzilla? Absolutely. But what about you? Would you care to see something like that? I imagine maybe so. What about other directors that you could see giving an interesting take on a Godzilla story? Maybe Guillermo del Toro. That would be really cool, right? Or what about Denis Villeneuve of Dune and Blade Runner 2049 fame? I think that would be pretty incredible as well. Is there another franchise that you would love to see Christopher Nolan get a crack at? What about Star Wars? Man, I think that would be an interesting sight to see. Christopher Nolan's Star Wars trilogy, that would be something else. Well, tell me all of your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think you could see Nolan pulling off a Godzilla movie? Would it be possible to make it any better than Godzilla Minus One? Would it be a mistake to try? What other themes and ideas do you see throughout Nolan's movies that you think, yeah, if that was in a Godzilla movie, that would be pretty spectacular? But let me know in the comments below. And thanks again for watching. Hey, if you enjoy videos like this, where we're not just talking about movies, we're not just talking about television series or streaming series, but we're actually trying to grapple with the deeper ideas embedded in the stories that guide us in our culture. And in doing that, we're learning something about philosophy or religion. If you enjoy that, I invite you to click the subscribe button below, turn on notifications. And if you're really wild about what I'm doing and you want to support it, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon today. You'll find a link below in the description.